When the people gathered to hear Rehoboam's response, there was a mixture of expectation and anxiety in the air. Many still remembered the time when Solomon, Rehoboam's father, had been a king admired for his wisdom and the splendor of the temple he had built. Even though Solomon's demands were heavy, the people waited for the new, younger, and less rigid king to show empathy for their needs. Representatives from each tribe came together and, with one voice, conveyed to the new king a sincere and respectful appeal. They wanted relief from the strenuous obligations imposed during Solomon's long reign. The representatives' words echoed through the hall like a call for hope and renewal. Every look at Rehoboam reflected a silent plea, a hope that the king would be willing to listen. The expectation was that he would give a compassionate response, one that would show sensitivity to the pain of his people and commit to a reign of justice. However, Rehoboam had already decided to seek advice before taking any position, and among the many advisors at his disposal, the voices of young people, full of ambition and ideas of authority, stood out. Instead of suggesting compassion, they encouraged Rehoboam to adopt an inflexible stance, arguing that absolute strength and authority would make him respected and feared. These young advisors saw in Rehoboam the opportunity to strengthen royal rule with an even firmer stance. For them, a strong ruler did not give in. He expanded his control and made it clear that his power could not be questioned. Moved by the rigid vision of these counselors, Rehoboam, without hesitation, announced his decision with harsh and unforgiving words. "If my father imposed a heavy yoke on you, I will make it even heavier," said Rehoboam, looking directly at the people. "If my father punished you with stripes, I will punish you with scorpions." Silence fell over the crowd. These words fell like stones upon the hearts of the gathered tribes. What was supposed to be a new era of hope now became a promise of an even darker future. Instead of relief, Rehoboam announced that he would increase the demands, intensifying the weight that was already crushing the people. Those words provoked an immediate and inevitable reaction. Disappointment and indignation took over the people, who felt their hopes were destroyed in the face of the king's inflexibility. Among the northern tribes, dissatisfaction spread quickly like a flame on a dry field. Rehoboam's decision was seen as a clear demonstration that he did not care about the outcry of his people, and it ignited a spark of rebellion among them. In this moment of crisis, Jeroboam, a former trusted official, became the figure the people needed. Skillful and charismatic, he had earned the respect of the northern tribes and understood the pain and frustrations they felt. Jeroboam then became the natural leader of the separation movement. He inspired the tribes to defy the yoke of the house of David, asserting that the northern kingdom would no longer bear the weight of the demands imposed by the Jerusalem monarchy. Under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes decided to move away and break ties with the southern kingdom. In doing so, they formed the northern kingdom of Israel, a decision that represented more than a simple political separation. This act of rupture was a declaration of independence, a cry for justice and freedom for a people who felt abandoned and ignored. The division between north and south was like a deep cut in the heart of Israel. The people, previously united under the rule of a single king, were now separated into two distinct kingdoms: the northern kingdom, under the command of Jeroboam, and the southern kingdom, still governed by Rehoboam and the lineage of David. This separation not only fragmented the territory, but also created a spiritual and emotional wound, a scar that would forever mark the history of Israel, echoing for generations as the tragic result of an inflexible choice and a heart deaf to the pleas of the people. During Solomon's reign, great social inequality was slowly established among the people of Israel. Although he was a king of great wisdom and skill, his policies began to benefit only a small elite around the royal palace, those who were close to power. This elite, made up of nobles, high-ranking government officials, and those who oversaw the work of the palace, enjoyed a life of privilege and prosperity, while the majority of the people worked hard to support the kingdom. As taxes increased, the burden on the people became unbearable. Farmers, artisans, and workers in all parts of Israel were exhausted and, at the same time, felt that they were not receiving benefits commensurate with their sacrifice. Their crops and savings were drained to maintain the court's luxury and finance Solomon's ambitions, while they themselves sank into hardship. The difference between the elite and the common people became increasingly evident, and society, once relatively united, was now divided by an abyss of inequality. This scenario created an environment of increasing tension. The murmurs of discontent were muffled by those who defended Solomon, but deep down, resentment began to bubble. The people questioned the justice of the system, why their families needed to give up so much while a minority prospered through their sweat. This resentment was not just a reflection of an economic situation. It was also a crisis of trust between the tribes of Israel and the royalty. The tribes, who had initially supported unification under the reign of David and Solomon, now felt ignored and devalued. Dissatisfaction spread quickly, creating a delicate and unstable political climate where each decision seemed to increase tensions. For many, Solomon's succession could represent a chance for change, an opportunity for the next king to redress these injustices and ease the people's burden. When Rehoboam, Solomon's son, finally assumes the throne, he inherits not only the splendor of his father's kingdom, but also this environment of tensions, inequality, and unmet expectations. Rehoboam was faced with an enormous challenge. The people expected him to be the leader capable of bringing relief, listening to their pain, and, who knows, reestablishing the balance that had been lost over the years. When Rehoboam ascended the throne of Israel, the atmosphere among the people was one of hope and caution. After years under the heavy burden of high taxes and forced labor, which financed the great projects of their father, Solomon, the people yearned for genuine change. They still remembered Solomon's splendor, his legendary wisdom, and the wonders he had built, especially the temple, the ultimate symbol of devotion to God and the power of the kingdom. These stories were told in every village and city in Israel. But at the same time, the people could not ignore the difficulties they faced in sustaining this legacy. The opulence of Solomon's court and projects came at a high price, and this price was paid with the sweat and sacrifice of ordinary citizens. Now, with Rehoboam's coronation, the people saw a new opportunity, a breath of hope. Rehoboam was young and inexperienced, but for many this could be an advantage. There was an expectation that, with his heart not yet hardened by the experience of power, he would be able to put himself in the shoes of the most humble, to look at the suffering of his subjects and govern with empathy and compassion. Perhaps he could restore the balance between the splendor of the kingdom and the well-being of the people, promoting a reign of justice and relief for those who carried the weight of Israel's greatness on their shoulders. Shortly after his coronation, a decisive meeting was organized. Representatives from all the tribes of Israel were summoned, a group made up of the wisest elders and leaders, those who knew the realities and needs of every corner of the kingdom. For the people, this meeting was a unique opportunity to speak directly to the new king, a chance to be heard and to bring to light the hardships they had silently endured during Solomon's reign. The elders, who were respected for their wisdom and experience, came with hearts full of responsibility. Every word they spoke represented the outcry of their tribes, their families, friends, and neighbors. At that moment, they were not just leaders, they were the very voice of the nation. When the meeting began, the representatives spoke with sincerity and respect. In a solemn tone, they explained the difficulties they had been experiencing for years. They told of sleepless nights, wondering how they would support their families while much of their harvest went into the royal coffers. They reported the devastating impact of forced labor, which took men away from their families for months at a time, weakening communities and forcing women and children to bear the weight of responsibilities at home alone. Some of the representatives had a tired look, marked by years of struggle, and their emotional voices revealed a deep desire for relief. The message was clear and direct. The people of Israel needed a king who understood their pain and needs. They needed someone who could bring justice to the throne, who was willing to reduce the burden of obligations and restore harmony to the kingdom. All eyes turned to Rehoboam, waiting for him to respond sensitively. After all, he had the chance to become an admired ruler, to be remembered as the king who restored peace and prosperity to his people. This meeting was more than a request for tax reductions and relief from demands. He represented the hope of a new beginning. Every word, every gesture was loaded with expectation. The people wanted a reign where the burden was lessened and the tribes could live and work in peace. Rehoboam, with one simple decision, had the opportunity to mark the beginning of an era of unity and understanding, and the people eagerly awaited the answer that would define their future. When Rehoboam assumed the throne, the atmosphere in Israel was one of intense expectation. The people were exhausted from the years of heavy tribute and forced labor that sustained the splendor of Solomon's reign. For many, the new reign represented the chance for a fresh start, to see a leader who would understand their difficulties and ease their burdens. There was a collective sigh of hope, as if everyone was hoping that Rehoboam would be different from his father, more sensitive and willing to listen. So a meeting was arranged. Rehoboam would meet with representatives of the tribes of Israel. These men, chosen leaders, came from all parts of the kingdom, bringing in their voices the pain and concerns of the people. For the common people, this meeting was a decisive moment. They knew it was their only chance to be heard, to show the new king how high taxes and forced labor had exhausted their strength and broken up their families. During the meeting, the representatives spoke frankly. They told of long working hours away from their homes and the land they worked so hard to cultivate. They revealed the impact of taxes that consumed the harvest and left little to support their families. With words full of emotion, they conveyed to Rehoboam the cry of the tribes who yearned for a ruler who was, above all, a servant of the people, someone who cared about their sufferings and needs. The expectation was clear. Rehoboam had the opportunity to become a king who would return peace and prosperity to the people, who would rebuild trust between the royalty and the tribes. In the hearts of everyone there pulsed a silent plea for the new king to have empathy and compassion, and understand that governing was not just about maintaining the splendor of the throne, but also about caring for those who supported the kingdom with their own sweat. When the people gathered to hear Rehoboam's answer, hope still vibrated in their hearts. Those representing the tribes of Israel had sincerely and respectfully conveyed the cry for relief from the demands imposed during Solomon's reign. What everyone expected to hear was a compassionate response, a word that demonstrated that the new king was attentive to the pain of his people. However, Rehoboam had sought advice in making his decision, and the voices of the young counselors, ambitious and firm, had stood out. These young men encouraged him to adopt a tough stance, arguing that a strong ruler should assert himself even more and show that his rule could not be challenged. "If my father imposed a heavy yoke on you, I will make it heavier still," Rehoboam said to the people. "If my father punished you with stripes, I will punish you with scorpions." These words fell like stones into the hearts of the gathered tribes. Instead of relief, Rehoboam announced that he would increase demands and maintain the burden that was already crushing them. Dissatisfaction spread quickly like a flame in a dry field. Disappointment and indignation gripped the northern tribes, who felt ignored and betrayed. For them, Rehoboam's inflexibility was a clear demonstration that he was not willing to listen to the people's cry. His response, instead of restoring peace, ignited a spark of rebellion among the tribes. At this time of crisis, Jeroboam, a former official who had gained the trust of the northern tribes, assumed leadership of the movement. He understood that, under Rehoboam's rule, the tribes would never find the justice they sought, nor the rest they so desired. Jeroboam inspired the northern tribes to throw off the yoke imposed by the house of David. They decided that they could no longer bear the burden of royal demands. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes separated and formed the northern kingdom of Israel. The division was like a deep cut in the heart of Israel. The people, previously united under one king, were now separated into two distinct kingdoms. The northern kingdom, led by Jeroboam, and the southern kingdom, still under the rule of Rehoboam and the lineage of David. This division not only fragmented the territory, but also created a wound that would forever mark the history of Israel. With the definitive division of the kingdoms, the climate of tension between the north and the south was palpable. Rehoboam, still resentful of the separation of the northern tribes, thought about mobilizing an army to try to regain control over the lost lands. For him, it was a matter of honor and a desire to restore the glory of the house of David throughout Israel. However, before any step was taken, divine intervention changed the course of events. God, through a prophet, instructed Rehoboam and the tribes of the southern kingdom not to attack their brothers in the north. The message was clear: this division is part of my plan. God revealed that the separation between the kingdoms was under his control, and that any attempt at unification by force would not have divine support. The intervention had a profound impact, reminding everyone that above human conflicts and ambitions, the Lord was in charge and had a greater purpose. With this, Rehoboam was forced to contain his desire for war, and the southern kingdom accepted the new reality. Meanwhile, in the northern kingdom, Jeroboam faced a complex situation. Although he was the new leader of the northern tribes, he knew that the spiritual hearts of the people were still focused on Jerusalem, where Solomon's temple, the central place of worship, remained. Fearing that his people might return to Jerusalem to worship and thus begin to harbor loyalty to the southern kingdom, Jeroboam made a drastic decision to consolidate his reign. Instead of encouraging the people to remain faithful to the worship traditions in Jerusalem, Jeroboam decided to establish a new system of worship. He ordered the construction of two altars, one in Bethel and the other in Dan. And on these altars, he ordered golden calves to be erected. "Here are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt," Jeroboam proclaimed to the people, turning them away from the true worship of God and introducing idolatry into the northern kingdom. The prophets sent by God tried to warn him of the spiritual consequences of this decision. They warned Jeroboam about the danger of moving the people away from the true God, of deviating from the commandments, and of opening the doors to idolatry. The message was straightforward. If Jeroboam obeyed God's ways, he could establish a lasting dynasty in the northern kingdom. However, if he chose to ignore these instructions and turn to idolatry, he would face divine judgment. Unfortunately, Jeroboam did not heed the warnings of the prophets. His decision to create golden calf altars not only diverted the people from their spiritual connection to Jerusalem, but also instituted a new spiritual identity for the northern kingdom. This idolatry turned the northern tribes away from true worship and weakened their connection with God. While the southern kingdom, with Rehoboam, maintained David's lineage and the temple as a spiritual center, the northern kingdom followed a path of spiritual deviation, which would bring harsh consequences in the future. As the years passed, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom followed paths increasingly distant from God, despite repeated warnings sent by his prophets. In the northern kingdom, the kings who succeeded Jeroboam kept the people under practices of idolatry and increasingly moved away from the spiritual traditions of their ancestors. Worship of golden calves and other pagan rituals became common, and the call to return to the true faith was ignored. This distance from God, combined with internal disputes and political instability, weakened the northern kingdom to the point of making it vulnerable to foreign threats. Finally, in 722 BC, Assyria, a ruthless military power of the time, invaded the northern kingdom. Without divine protection and without the internal cohesion necessary to resist, the kingdom succumbed to the invaders. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, was besieged, conquered, and devastated. Many were killed, and the rest of the population was taken into exile, dispersed across foreign lands. The people of Israel, who had once been united and blessed, now found themselves scattered among the nations, separated from their land and their identity. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom of Judah, history seemed to follow a similar pattern. Although there were times of partial return to God under godly kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah, the nation as a whole continued to oscillate between periods of faithfulness and idolatry. Judah also received several warnings from the prophets, but like the northern kingdom, it refused to fully listen. This lack of commitment to God and attachment to their own pagan interests and practices progressively weakened the kingdom. In the year 586 BC, a new power emerged, Babylon, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, which already dominated much of the known world. Judah, weakened and isolated, could not resist Babylonian power. Jerusalem, the holy city, was besieged and destroyed. Solomon's temple, the symbol of worship and the presence of God, was reduced to rubble, leaving the people desolate. Many were killed, and those who survived were taken captive to Babylon, beginning a long period of exile and suffering in foreign lands. Thus, the division that began under Rehoboam's reign led to the collapse and final fall of the two kingdoms. The lack of unity and the abandonment of God's ways culminated in disasters that marked the history of Israel forever. The people who had once been chosen and protected were now experiencing the harsh consequences of their choices and the division that one day began with Rehoboam's unyielding decision. Rehoboam's response was not what the people expected. Instead of heeding the cry for relief, he opted for an even harsher stance, adding to the burden that was already too heavy for the people to bear. This inflexible decision triggered a movement of dissatisfaction that quickly turned into rebellion, especially among the northern tribes. They came together under the leadership of Jeroboam, a former official who understood the needs and pain of the people, and decided that they would no longer bear the yoke of the house of David. The division was inevitable. Israel, a once united nation, found itself fragmented into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, led by Jeroboam, and the southern kingdom, ruled by Rehoboam, a direct descendant of David. This rupture not only separated the people geographically, but also planted the seeds of a deep spiritual and political wound that would last for generations. The division brought with it numerous consequences. In the northern kingdom, idolatry was established as a way to keep the people away from the temple in Jerusalem, which diverted them from true worship. Prophets were sent to warn the kings of the north and south about the dangers of abandoning God's commandments, but most leaders did not listen. Each kingdom followed its own path, increasingly distant from the values that once united Israel. Years passed, and the lack of unity and spiritual fidelity weakened both kingdoms. Eventually, the northern kingdom succumbed to Assyrian invaders, who conquered its lands and exiled its people, scattering them among other nations. Later, the southern kingdom faced a similar defeat at the hands of the Babylonians, who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, driving the population into exile. This was the end of a divided nation and the fulfillment of the prophecy that God had announced as a consequence of their infidelity and disunity. The history of Israel during this period leaves us with a powerful lesson about the consequences of inflexible choices and rulers who do not heed the call of their people. The division and ultimate fall of the kingdom shows how a lack of compassion and a resistance to listening to people's voices can lead to a path of destruction. Rehoboam's decision to toughen the people's burden marked the beginning of an era of conflict and suffering, but it also served as a reminder of the importance of leading with justice, empathy, and faithfulness. Thus, the history of Israel becomes a warning for all times, teaching that true leadership is not in power, but in the ability to listen, understand, and care for those who are led.